the NTC webinar series. Today's webinar, titled Changing Fuel Consumption, COVID-19 and Other Challenges, Perspectives on the State of State Funds and Environmental Insurance, is the final webinar in NUIPIC's four-part series that builds off of the themes planned for the now postponed National Tanks Conference, which was rescheduled for September of 2021. Please be on the lookout for future announcements related to the 2021 National Tanks Conference. For today's session, attendees will hear from EPA's Office of Underground Storage Tanks about the general picture of state funds and revenue nationally. Attendees will learn how changes in fuel consumption may impact the viability of state funds in the future, and this discussion will include takeaways regarding fuel use projections from a recent actuarial analysis conducted in the state of Utah. Attendees will hear from panelists from the environmental insurance industry about the impact of changing fuel consumption, emerging fuels, and extreme weather. The panel will also provide perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 to both state funds and insurance. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Will Anderson is the director of the Cleanup and Revitalization Division in EPA's Office of Underground Storage Tanks, where he and his team focus on technical cleanup issues, state funds and financial responsibility, petroleum brownfields, and reducing the backlog of LUST sites. His state fund review work involves collaborating with EPA regions and states to ensure that state funds are performing well and cleanups are being completed. Will has been with the EPA for over 27 years, about half of that time in OUST. Outside of work, Will enjoys cycling and embarrassing his teenage children with his mere existence. Emma Krulik joined the EPA and the Office of Underground Storage Tanks in January of this year. She is the project lead for state fund soundness and financial responsibility at OUST, as well as the Region 7 liaison and the Oswego Grant Project Officer. Before joining the Tanks family, Emma graduated from Brandeis University in 2017 with a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and spent 2 years serving in Peace Corps, North Macedonia. Mahesh Albuquerque is the director of the Colorado Division of Oil and Public Safety, and he's served in this role for over a decade. His vision has always been to change the public perception of government. He also serves on several national boards and technical committees striving to improve codes, standards, and regulations related to environmental protection and public safety. Mahesh's career began as an environmental consultant prior to founding his own company. He joined the division in 1999. Mahesh received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in geology from the University of Bombay and completed senior executive leadership programs at Harvard University. Theron Blatter is the manager for the Underground Storage Tank branch of the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. In this capacity, he's responsible for oversight of Utah's compliance and enforcement program, LUST Cleanup, and Petroleum Storage Tank Cleanup Fund. He's been involved in Utah UST program for the past 29 years, 8 as an UST field inspector, 11 as the UST compliance program manager, and the last 10 as UST branch manager. Theron received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Geology from Brigham Young University. Greg Travis is the product line manager for Berkeley Environmental's commercial storage tank insurance product. He has responsibility for the long-term success of the product and management of multiple tank underwriting teams. Prior to joining Berkeley in 2010, he worked for another major environmental insurance carrier in multiple roles related to site pollution liability product lines, as well as management of environmental risk consulting teams. Prior to his insurance career, Greg held various management positions at engineering and construction consultancy and a commercial general contractor. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Building Construction from the Georgia Institute of Technology. David Waddles is currently the Chief Operating Officer of the Idaho Petroleum Storage Tank Fund. He is tasked with managing the PSTF underwriting, claims, and loss control departments. The PSTF is a division of the Idaho State Insurance Fund, which is the designated administrator for the Idaho Petroleum Clean Water Trust Fund. Dave has been an insurance professional since 1999 and has worked for the Idaho State Insurance Fund since 2015. He has a bachelor's in business information systems from Ashford University, an AINS designation from the Insurance Institutes, and has studied accountancy at Boise State University. Finally, Robert Winterburn serves as Vice President at Chubb Environmental. Based in Philadelphia, Mr. Winterburn is responsible for Chubb's storage tank book of business throughout the United States and Canada. With more than 30 years of experience in the insurance, contracting, and environmental regulatory industries, Mr. Winterburn has held various insurance positions, including environmental claims, underwriting, and risk engineering. Prior to his years in insurance, he was a regulator with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. He was also a project manager for an environmental contracting firm that specialized in emergency response, storage tank removal, and environmental remediation. Mr. Winterburn holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from Stockton University. Please join me in virtually welcoming our excellent panel. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and begin with today's first speakers. I'm happy to introduce Will Anderson and Emma Krulik with EPA's Office of Underground Storage Tanks.
Great, thanks, Drew. This is Will. I'll go first and then I'll turn it over to Emma. We're really excited to be part of this panel. It's a great group. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. Our role, EPA, for this webinar is really to sort of set the foundation and let folks know where things stand with state funds. We do annual reviews of state funds, and we're currently working on FY20 reviews, but we have our kind of high-level data we want to share with you regarding our FY19 reviews. So just a quick reminder for the folks on the line, I think everybody knows this, but owners and operators are required to have financial responsibility. There are a number of mechanisms out there, but the two most common are state cleanup funds and environmental insurance. We'll talk a bit about state funds, then Mahesh and Darren will, and then we'll have some folks talking about insurance after that. EPA looks at state funds every year as part of our review. We actually were the ones who approved the state funds when they came in to raise their hand and say they wanted to serve as an FR mechanism for owners and operators in their state. And so since we approved them, we feel like we should look at them, and we look to see how they're doing both from an environmental perspective, are they getting sites cleaned up? And from the financial perspective, do they have enough money to get the job done? It's really a collaborative process that we do with both those of us, Emma and I, at headquarters, along with the EPA regions, working with the states to talk through kind of what issues and challenges there may be and to work together to address them. What we're going to do today is we're going to show you a little bit kind of our data, the kind of things we look at, let you see sort of the distribution of where states fall out on some of the key metrics. I just want to say up front, we do not compare states to one another. We look at each state individually and compare it to itself over time. So why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide. I think Emma's driving, right? Thanks. Okay, so real quick, here's a map of the US, and what you're looking at are states that are state fund states. Those are the ones in blue, 36. And you see a few in green. Those are states that had state funds but have since closed them down or sunset. So they're still responsible for the sites that were on the books when they closed, but most of the states have kind of moved through that and cleaned those up. And then we have gray states are the ones that do not have state funds, and they're principally doing insurance and the other mechanisms as well. Let's move to the next slide. Wanted to show you, again, high level, trying to give you some background and foundation in this. This is information that we actually got from the SWOMO in their annual state fund survey. It basically just gives you a flavor for how much money is moving into these funds and moving through them on an annual basis. So you can see the revenue is pretty incredible, $1.8 billion in annual revenue. Current balance is over $2.5 billion. And if you look at how much is getting paid out, the annual payout at the bottom there is over $625 million, and then total payout cumulative is over $23 billion. So that's a lot of money. State funds are really an important part of the program for those states that have them. They're sort of the engine that get the cleanups done, and they support the program, and we think they're real important. So that's why we look at them, and we work with the states to try to make sure that their funds are performing well. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emma. She is our project lead for this work. And Emma's going to walk you through some of the, like I said, the key indicators, key metrics that we look at with states. And we'll be happy to answer questions at the end. So Emma, take it away.
All right, thanks, Will. So overall, most funds are functioning just like they're supposed to. Every year, like Will said, EPA reviews all of the state funds with a couple of exceptions, and Usually this is just a way to check in with funds, and if they're doing really well, even a chance to share best practices across states. However, sometimes there will be data that raises some questions for EPA, and that would be if maybe the fund doesn't look like they have enough cash to pay for unpaid claims. Maybe the fund is only paying on a small percentage of sites in the fund backlog. Maybe states aren't demonstrating sufficient capacity to close out sites, or maybe it's taking a really long time to close out sites. Or maybe the fund has a huge cash balance, which might make it a target for raids. If any of these things seem like a hindrance to getting cleanups completed, EPA might initiate a Tier 2 review with the state, which is a process of collecting more data to gain a deeper understanding of the fund and identifying problems and potential solutions. EPA has done a handful of Tier 2 reviews collaboratively with state funds, and those have been helpful in getting those state funds back to a place where they can function better. Here's another look at the general state of state funds in fiscal year 19, which is the most full review that EPA conducted. Right now we're working on fiscal year 20. So this data is collected from the FY19 state fund workbooks. It's important to mention that when we review state funds, like Will had said before, we don't usually compare states to each other. We look at trends over time in a given state fund, but we collated this data just to give you an idea of the range of the data that we see. So first of all, there's some encouraging data here. The median backlog reduction for all federally regulated fund eligible, or known as FERFI from this point forward, sites across states in FY19 was -3%. So that's good. We also look at how much money did the fund spend on their available balance, out of their available balance, and the median for that in fiscal year 19 was 44.5%. Another indicator of progress and action that a fund is taking is looking at how many sites in its FERFI backlog received a payment in a given year. And in fiscal year 19, the median for this was 53% of sites. Also, we look at time it takes to start and finish cleanups. So for all the funds this year, the median number of months to start a cleanup was 6, and the median months to finish a cleanup was 78. And now on the following slides, we'll go into each of these data metrics more in depth. So this bar chart shows the FERFI backlog reduction, and you can see that there are some pretty extreme differences here in the data. So on the top, you can see that one state experienced a 30% reduction in their backlog, and on the other end of the spectrum, one state had a backlog go up by 23%. So there were some unique scenarios for both of these states that made their numbers so extreme. So that's one reason why we look at median instead of average, because there are sometimes some random outliers. And if a state does have great backlog reduction year to year, like we said before, we might ask the state to share its best practices. So good news, like I said before, most states did see a decrease in their backlog, all the states on the left side here, with -3 being the median, -3%. So we look at percent of money available spent as one general indicator of activity in a state fund. Of course, we know a portion of the money that state funds spend every year go to expenses other than being paid to contractors, but it is one good indicator to look at. So this chart shows every state's percentage of how much money they spent in their fund, and you can see a huge range of numbers, which just means that every fund is different. So for example, some of the small numbers at the bottom, like where only 8% of sites received a payment, that would probably be an example of a state fund that functions more like private insurance. And so they keep a large balance on hand to pay for their liabilities. And as long as the environmental performance is strong, then this isn't generally going to be a problem. All right, so this chart shows the percentage of open sites that received a payment for each state fund in the fiscal year. So we also know that not getting payments could be more indicative of some kind of program issue on the left side rather than an issue with the state fund. So that's just one more example of how each piece of data on its own doesn't tell a full story. Again, there's another huge data range here. Like I mentioned before, we generally like to see when states pay on a high percentage of their funds because typically, but not always, that would indicate fund activity. However, if a state has a lot of sites that are in monitored natural attenuation and maybe their sampling schedule is less frequent than an annual basis, they probably aren't receiving annual payments. So that would depend on the individual standards for each state, and that would lead to, and again, a huge range in data. So like on the previous two slides, we mentioned that the two data trends that we analyze and compare together for a snapshot of the fund is percentage of available money spent and fund spending on percentage of open FERFI sites. So you can see that some of the data here sticks out, and those are states that are probably on our watch list. So for example, if a fund is spending 88% of their available balance, but only under 30% of their open sites got a payment in a year, we might wonder if the fund has enough cash to really make progress on reducing their number of open sites. On the flip side, if a state is making payments on almost all of its sites but keeping a huge balance on hand, we would be watchful of potential raids on the fund, especially in light of the current situation for most states' budgets. And again, another huge range of data for this, again indicating that each state fund program is different. So this slide and the next slide will show the speed in which states start and finish cleanups. The median months for all states in fiscal year 19 to start a cleanup is 6. And also each state program probably measures this differently. So some states consider starting a cleanup to be when a file is created for it. Some states consider a start to be when boots are on the ground. So again, like we mentioned before, we typically don't compare states to each other. We just look at trends over time because of the differences in the programs. So this one is median months to complete a cleanup for all cleanups that finished in fiscal year 19. So again, pretty huge data range here from 2 months at the bottom to over 200 months at the top. Sometimes those surprisingly high values would induce a conversation with EPA and the state. But it's also important to point out that different state standards would cause some states to have much longer median cleanup times, like probably for the ones at the top here. Some states always clean up to drinking water standards, and those would have higher median cleanup times, and that would explain the numbers. So moving forward, EPA is working on reviewing the fiscal year 20 state fund workbooks. There are 35 of them, and we'll be interested to see what changes occur between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 when we finish collating the data. Also, we'll be interested in looking to see if there will be any COVID impacts to state funds and potential solutions to those. And as a reminder, I can be reached for any state fund questions at the contact info on this screen. And with that, we can open it up to broader questions. And Drew, I will pass it back to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Emma and Will, for presenting today. So I do want to go ahead and, as Emma was just saying, open it up to the audience. And just a friendly reminder, no need to wait. Again, we'll do periodic Q&A breaks today. No need to wait until these Q&A prompting slides come up. If a question comes up, send it in, and we'll work to get to it at the right time today. So I'm going to pull that up and see. Emma, if you would, I think someone missed you spell out what the FRFE stood for.
Sure, federally regulated fund eligible. It's a tongue twister.
Great, thanks.
Not all state funds cover all of the tanks in their state, all the owners, and so we look at the subset of tanks that are covered by the fund, and that's the federally regulated fund eligible, and it is a tongue twister.
So we got a question here for both of you, I guess. Do states have access to a summary of state fund reviews each year?
We have not produced a summary report. We do these presentations on an annual basis, but basically each of the states is working with us on their data. I know that in several instances, some of the states in, I think it might have been Region 1, we're talking about getting together to talk about their results. But we view it as something that, each fund is just different enough that it's challenging to present things in a sort of summary format. And so even the slides that we did today, I think are more interesting to see the range. But as Emma had mentioned, there are a number of kind of pretty significant differences between funds, whether it's the size of the deductible or the cleanup standard that they're going for, the size of their staff, number of reasons why it's pretty tough to do a hard compare between states.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I don't see anything else, but I am going to give it, we've got a little time here. It's just another minute or so. If you're sitting on a question you want to ask, there's no bad questions for today. So please fire away. I'll leave it open for another 30 seconds to a minute. All right, so I have another one here. And the question is, where do most states with funds get the funding? Is it a fuel tax?
Good question. Yes, it's typically, some call it a fee because they don't like to call it a tax, but yeah, in general, there's some sort of fee or tax on gasoline sold. It does vary by state as to exactly how it works, and then maybe Mahesh or Aaron can talk about how it works in their state as a sideline for their presentation. But yeah, that's where most of it. Some get theirs from like tank fees, but that's typically not a significant amount of money compared to the tax revenue generated.
Great, thank you. I'm going to fire off one more, and they all kind of came in here. So can you talk a little bit about how is the median time to complete cleanups changing over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we showed two different slides. One was the time to start and then the time to clean up. We've seen some movement and we've seen some that are, I guess the theory is that the newer releases are coming in, they're being discovered faster and they're being cleaned up quicker. But it's been hard for us since we just get the data, sort of summary information from the state. If the state is also cleaning up some of its old legacy sites, those values also are in the mix. And if it's a state that has a relatively small caseload or backlog, their numbers can jump around a bit. So I guess I would say it's not a clean trend line in a downward direction, although I think anecdotally that's what many of the states will tell us.
Okay, great. So I'm going to hang on to, I think I have one or two more here that I'll see if we have time for at the end. But again, thanks so much to Will and Emma with EPA OUST for starting us off today. With that, I'm happy to go ahead and switch gears and introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mahesh Albuquerque with Colorado Division of Oil and Public Safety.
Thank you, Drew. Appreciate the opportunity to participate on this webinar and kind of share some of my thoughts about OUST program revenue now and in the future. And as we kind of heard from Will earlier, where he said state funds are the engine that helps drive cleanups and environmental protection. It certainly is kind of an important aspect of our programs. And as somebody asked earlier, where does this revenue come from? And I'm hoping I'd be able to answer some of that and then just share some thoughts that I have on how our revenue could be impacted and things that we can do and some things that may be beyond our control, but some things that we need to look at planning for. So this slide here kind of shows fuel tax revenue, and every state in the country imposes tax on fuels, gasoline, diesel, and certain other fuels. And there's typically two components of that tax. There's a federal component, and then each state has its portion of state tax that's collected on every gallon. And that varies significantly. I think from a low in Alaska to I think highest in California. But on average, the taxes collected on let's say a gallon of gasoline are in the 50 some cents between the state and the federal taxes, and a cent of that goes into the LUST tank fee at the federal level, and I think most states also impose a small tax, a portion of their tax, usually a cent or a fraction of a cent per gallon, that goes into their tank programs. I think, as we saw from the previous presentation and the 36 states that have state-funded programs, almost all of them get a significant portion of their fund revenue from fuel taxes. Some also, as was mentioned earlier, get some of their revenue from other fees, tank registration fees and fines and other types of things that are imposed on regulated owners. But I would say almost every state, whether or not they have a fund, get some revenue to their tanks programs, whether it be from federal grants or from their own funds from fuel taxes. So it's a really important aspect and something that we need to understand and kind of pay attention to as time progresses. In the past, when the gas taxes, and use that term loosely for gas and diesel fuel taxes, were imposed, they were primarily to support highway infrastructure. But over the years, with pet projects and other new competing needs, and seeing that there's a big revenue source, some of those monies have been devoted to other uses. So here, what I wanted to kind of illustrate and show is US gasoline consumption, almost from the inception of the tanks program in the late 80s to now. And if you look at it, there's been a pretty steady decline or increase in gasoline consumption from the 90s through the 2000s. And kind of what I want to get you to kind of relate is increase in consumption means increase in tax. So we've been kind of through a period in that first decade of a steady increase in consumption, so increase in funds that go into our storage tank funds, among other things. From 2000 on, seems like things have started to flatten out. There's been a variety of reasons for why that has occurred. Everything from fuel efficiency, price of gas, wars, variety of different things. But I think the important thing is the first 10 years of the tanks program being pretty healthy as far as increasing revenues from a tax standpoint. To me, COVID was kind of a real wake-up call, and I kind of made the connection between, hey, what does staying at home, how's that going to affect our fund revenues? And as you can see from this graph here, COVID alone in just a few weeks has had the biggest impact on fuel consumption since the 90s. It's like a 30-some% decline in just that 2-3 week period that has been most significant over the last 20, 25, 30 years here. And if you get closer at it, the different fuels that took the hit, I think the biggest hit was the airline industry, 60% decline in jet fuel. But then next was motor gasoline, and it was a 40% decline there. And I think the one that kind of weathered the storm the best was, at least in the initial first 4 weeks, was diesel, with seeing only a 20% decline. All this information that I'm showing out here is from the US Energy Information Administration. And these were some of the predictions or some of the actuals that they reported early in March and into April with these declines. It certainly surprised me, especially nowadays when you go driving on the road and you see all these cars on the road, even though we're supposed to be, most of us, working from home. But it's kind of a good thing overall. I think the 20% decline on the distillate fuel was more with goods and the necessity for goods and groceries and online shopping and all that to continue, and the use of diesel out there. Here, looking at it a little more, stepping back, the blue indicates, the shaded blue indicates the 5-year range, where we would be kind of flatlined, maybe with a slight decline in fuel consumption. But the yellow line indicates from January through the different weeks this year, and you can see the steep decline during March and April. But the good news is we're kind of on a good recovery trajectory in fuel consumption. We just look at motor gasoline here, and we're pretty close to, we're still kind of trending as a nation below what the 5-year average or the average range would be, but we are kind of in a way better place than we were 6 or so months ago. And again, just wanted you to keep in mind, consumption, more revenue. So kind of wanted to share something that we encountered, and something that kind of scared us a bit in the onset of COVID in March and April. Our petroleum storage tank fund is dependent on fuel tax revenue. We collect an environmental response surcharge that's kind of set on a sliding scale. So the larger the fund balance we have, the lower the surcharge, and then as our fund balance decreases, we go to a maximum surcharge, and that varies from 0.5 cent to 1.25 of a cent, depending on what the fund balance is. The math for us is pretty straightforward and simple. We generate anywhere between $36 and $40 million a year through the environmental response surcharge that goes into our petroleum storage tank fund. And on a monthly basis, we pretty much spend about the same as we take in. So we pay out in cleanups $3 million in reimbursement claims, and we receive around $3 million through the fuel tax revenue. We kind of run a pretty tight ship, and historically, from prior challenges in the past, we kind of deliberately maintained a low balance, a low fund balance, so that it doesn't attract the attention of legislators and is susceptible to being raided. So with that come some challenges too, if your revenue stream gets impacted. And so when COVID hit, we were looking at some of the projections that we would see decline in our fuel tax revenue in March and April, significant declines in revenue, and we were kind of taking the conservative approach, thinking we'd see a $2 million in March and then a $1 million in April. And so if we did nothing based on this simple math on how much we take in and how much we spend, we'd be broke by the end of this fiscal year, or last fiscal year, or within 3 months of that time, which would have been the end of June of 2020. So here's some other things that were happening at that same time. Our legislature was in session, and our state was facing a $3 billion shortfall in our general fund. And so all cash funds were under scrutiny and susceptible to being kind of raided or transferred to the general fund. As I said earlier, we have and deliberately maintain a very low cash balance in our petroleum storage tank fund, so that was not on the radar. But we have another fund, Petroleum Cleanup and Redevelopment Fund, that we created through double dip settlements, and I think some of y'all may have heard me talk about that. It's our brownfields fund, and it's been pretty effective in cleaning up brownfield sites. And this year we were actually looking at using $2 million of that to do an infrastructure bill and some zero emission vehicle support stuff. And that bill was in the works, passed the Senate, and was going to the House for approval. But then COVID hit, and our balance in that fund was spotted, and so the legislature kind of came back to us and said, hey, we need most of your $7.5 million, and so requested a $6.7 million transfer to the state's general fund. So within a couple of weeks, that was what happened. Was like, hey, all this money goes away. So here's some of the things we did. We, like any prudent person would do if it was your own personal bank account, you stop spending or delaying, slowing down on spending and payments. We realized some cost savings from limited inspector travel. But I think the most important thing that we did was engaged with our Petroleum Marketers Association and looked at introducing a bill that would allow us to actually borrow some of our $6.7 million that was going to the general fund. So we asked to borrow $4 million of that $6.7 million before it went to the state's general fund to kind of shore up our petroleum storage tank fund. And so here's our outcomes. We were able to have that piece of legislation introduced. It passed the legislature, and it allowed us to get $4 million to kind of get us through the dip in revenues that we were anticipating. We were also effective in controlling costs otherwise, and actually surprised by the revenue that we did get, and we saw only around a 20% reduction rather than a deeper 50 or 60% that we were anticipating. And now we're in a pretty good position to kind of make payments back to our state's general fund. But the good news is, without that $4 million, we would not have been in a position to continue paying out on our claims and also giving out our incentives. In Colorado, the way it's set up, we do not have, the statute says that if there's money in the fund, the state's obligated to pay. If there isn't money, the state's not obligated to pay. So we are able to kind of run it the way we do. So if I were to kind of look into my crystal ball here on some of the future impacts to tax revenue, obviously the one that we are in now is ongoing, the working from home and its implications, studying from home, traveling less, essentially. But I think the ongoing work on fuel efficiency standards will have an impact, and I think later Taryn will get into more details. So I won't get into too much of it. Other factors include this population growth, greenhouse gas reduction targets, zero emission vehicle goals, and I'll just touch on the last two. So on this slide, it shows that almost 50% of the states have some greenhouse gas reduction targets, all a really good thing. I fully support them. But what it means is fossil fuel reduction and reduction in that aspect. And then 30% of states have agreed to work together that all heavy-duty trucks be electric by 2050. And this is not just talk. This is actual MOUs that have been signed by state governors. And again, it's a great thing. In fact, one of our infrastructure bills was to help things like this Budweiser truck happen, which happens to be a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle, and be great for air quality. But here's some questions that it kind of raises for me on, here's where we've been, the actual, and here's the projection. And the Energy Information Administration projects that by 2035, or in 15 years, we'll be below 1990 consumption. So at the start of the tanks program, the amount that we were consuming is what we will kind of go to in the next 15 years. So kind of want to leave you with some questions more than answers, and things to think about, and how you may want to look at protecting your own program and being prepared for the future. But what are society's funding priorities when budgets are tight? Different things rise to the surface, and is it health? Viruses, is that where more of the money needs to go, towards hospitals and healthcare there, or environmental cleanup? I think different priorities. really asking yourself how much of a reduction can your program sustain without making any changes. We would certainly not be able to sustain a 20% reduction for a prolonged period of time, and that's why we had that bill that went through. But it also raises questions on who pays for cleanup. Is it state fund, or does it have to go to private insurance, which is less affected by fuel tax revenue, as you'll see later in this presentations? And then who conducts inspections? If your budgets are squeezed, can you afford to do state inspections, or do you need to go to third-party inspections? So these are just some of the questions that I want to get you to start thinking about, and I think it'll help you ensure that your programs can continue successfully into the future. So with that, Drew, I think I'll hand it back to you and let Theron continue on.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Mahesh, for your presentation today. And we did get a couple of great questions, so we're going to hang on to these questions until our next Q&A period. And up next, I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Theron Blatter with Utah DEQ.
Thank you, Drew, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. Give me just a second here to. So one of the topics that was being discussed by the Eswamo State Fund Task Force, or State Fund FR Task Force, as we were preparing for the National Tanks Conference when we were hoping to have it in the spring, was let's look forward at the factors that might impact state fund revenues. What's out there in the next 20 to 30 years, and how do we as managers of funds approach that, and do we need to make any considerations or adjustments to our program? And then COVID came along, and it actually gave us a really interesting snapshot of what could be coming. And Mahesh has done a great job of kind of stepping us through what those impacts were, and we're seeing those things alleviate to some extent, but in reality, as that graph that Mahesh showed toward the end of his presentation, there really are factors out there, economic factors, that are going to significantly change the amount of petroleum that is used in the transportation industry. And the way we're currently mostly set up, 39 states collect revenue for their funds or the funds that have sunset already out of some revenue stream that comes off of petroleum sales. So if petroleum were to drop significantly in its use, we would see a pretty substantial loss in state fund revenue. And as you ask yourself the question, what does that do to my ability to pay claims? I want to start by sharing with you kind of an eye-opening experience I had when we were doing our actuarial analysis. In Utah, we're required to complete an annual actuarial analysis of our fund. And part of that analysis is a 10-year projection for our fund balance and our claim liability. And we had been using the same contractor for probably 10 or 15 years. And in 2019, we had to go out for a bid for a new contractor, and a different firm won the bid. So we were kind of starting with a different look at everything. I thought that would be interesting. But one of the things that really struck me was how different in our initial draft report, how different some of the projections were. And as I was digging into this before they finalized the report, a significant portion turned out to be just fuel projections. And so I'm gonna talk through that just a little bit. So start off with Actuarial 101, just so this makes sense to you. Really three key factors to look at. What is your fund balance, which is the money in your fund? Outstanding liability, that's the total known claims that the fund has incurred and not paid, and also projected claims that will be incurred. And this is the black box of the actuarial analysis. You put a bunch of numbers in and you get that out of it. And And then when you compare the two, you come up with the equity balance, which is the difference between your cash balance and your outstanding liability. So if you had 30 million in your fund and 50 million in outstanding liability, your equity balance would be a negative 20 million. Or, you know, flip the other way if you have a big cash balance and a low liability. But that's kind of what you're trying to get at. So this was our 2018 10-year projections, and I've highlighted 10 years out, which would be the year 2028. And our prior actuary had us at a cash balance of almost 19 million, 18.9, and an equity balance of minus 10.7 million. And those numbers have been pretty similar through the past several years, going in a direction of a lower and lower equity balance, which is what we're hoping for through the years, but always being a significant amount of negative equity. We get our draft number for 2019, and you can see down at the bottom now it's 2029, and our fund balance in this draft was 27.2 million, and our equity balance was a positive 3.7, almost 3.8 million. So we're talking huge difference here. Cash balance has gone up by 8.3 million, and the equity balance has gotten in the good by 14.5 million. And really had me scratching my head. What's going on? How could this be? And so I started digging into it and working with the actuary to understand it. And there are numerous factors, but one factor is fuel use. So this graph shows you, in the orange line, you see the 2018 Deloitte, which was our contractor was Deloitte. That was the fuel usage that they projected, and what the revenue that it would turn into. So starting out a little over probably about 5.6 million, and slowly declining year after year till it gets down to about maybe 5.3 million in 2028. The numbers that our new actuary Taylor and Mulder were using in their draft were a little bit higher, not a lot. When you actually look at it, it was only about, I think, 3% higher on average, and it kind of was steady declining along a similar slope, you know, year by year, but remaining about 3% higher, maybe a little more. And that turned into a difference of $4.6 million, and was an impact of a 20% either increase or decrease in the actual cash balance. So other factors also play a role that are outside the scope of what we're talking about, you know, in our overall difference. But fuel usage really did play a very key role. The yellow line you see is what they ended up coming back with for the number, which changed the projection significantly. We weren't in the positive equity balance. We were still negative, but we had gotten quite a bit better based on some of the other factors. So I guess the take-home message is that these fuel projections really can have a significant impact. So now I want to talk about what are some of the factors outside of COVID that really are going to come into play as we look forward the next, say, 20 years. And clearly, fuel efficiency standard is a very big one. Alternative fuel vehicle usage is a very big one. Something that just kind of popped out of nowhere that I want to look at is telework. And then a kind of a wild card is our population growth or decline state by state. And I'm sure there are other factors, but these are 4 fairly large ones. So this is some information on fuel usage that came out in 2017 from the U.S. Energy Information Association. And the graph furthest to the left shows you projections of miles to be traveled. So here we are in 2020, you can see moving into 2040, it's continuing to rise and continuing to rise. They have a 14% growth projection there. The next column in the middle is the miles per gallon that we anticipate will be the average for vehicles. And as you get out to 2040, from where we started in 2020, or 2000, that's a 59% increase in miles per gallon. I think this is based on the projections of where the standard was going to be, and that was, I think, at least temporarily suspended, but probably will go back now with a different administration. The overall impact, though, when you take increased miles and then subtract the changes by fuel efficiency, is a 25% drop in energy consumption in the transportation sector. So that right there is very big in our revenue stream if we lose 25% of the gallons sold. This is a graph of projections of electrical vehicle use or purchases, sales. It's a worldwide thing. So our piece would be just, in the United States would be just a chunk of it, but you can clearly see a trend as we move forward, and it's getting more and more to the point where they anticipate in 2040, 35% of all new vehicle sales will be electric vehicles. That is really hard to say exactly how that will play out, but you can see that becomes a very significant impact on the petroleum sales, which again is our main revenue source for almost all of our state funds. This next one is telework. So 2017, 30% of the vehicle miles that was traveled was commuting to and from work. And at that point in time, only 5.2% of the population worked from home. 85% drove to work, and a few others took transit and different things, but only 5.2% worked from home. If you look at the chart there in the middle, then after COVID, we went from very, very few people teleworking. If you go back to 17, it was 5.2%, to where 44% are working telework or telework 5 days a week, another 9% 3 or 4 days a week, 6% 1 to 2 days a week. It's hard to say how this will play out once the pandemic ends, but a lot of people have learned that remote work is a successful way to go, and things have gone well, and companies are saving money, and I think in government we found it to be pretty efficient. Looking at a quote from Global Analytics or Workplace Analytics there at the bottom, and they said our best estimate is 25 to 30% of the workforce will be working from home multiple days a week by the end of 2021. So I think that tells us that, yeah, telework is going to impact fuel usage. How much is hard to say, but it's going to be an impact, and it's going to drive down fund revenue. Then the last one is net population change. You can see here that different states have different potential impacts, but some states see a projected population growth of up to 45%, 40%, 35%. Some states see very little population growth as you look forward the next 20 some years. For our state, Utah, we've seen a continually ongoing increase, which I think has offset a lot of the other factors, but probably won't continue to do that as we see things like efficiency and electrical vehicles slowly drive down the opposite direction. So just in closing, kind of think about it, do the math in your head. We lose 25% to fuel efficiency, maybe up to another 35% to alternative fuel vehicles. Telework plays a role in there, maybe 5 or 10%, I don't know. And then you say, okay, what's my population in my state going to do? However it all works out in your state, I think it adds up to less revenue. And we do have time to make plans and to think about it, but I think it would be prudent for us as policy, not policy makers, but people that can influence policy within our states as we try and solve problems with our funds, that we think through this and not let it sneak up on us and surprise us, and suddenly we have way more costs and claims to pay than we have revenue to pay them. And with that, I think we'll take questions.
All right, thank you so much, Darren, for the presentation today. And I did get a few questions here, and again, fire away whenever you're ready. Attendees, send me questions, and I'll keep a log going. So that's for at this point, both for Mahesh and Theron. We'll do some Q&A. So I've got a couple I'm waiting in the wing for you here, Mahesh.
Sure.
So Mahesh, first question for you. Did you see a decrease in claims because consultants had to decrease field work due to COVID?
Good question. I think we may have seen a slight slowdown in claims, very briefly, just because of this significant change, but they're back up to what they were previously. And part of it was we, cut down on some monitoring requirements and all that, like I said, on some state lead sites. So we influenced that a little bit, but it wasn't a very significant slowdown.
Great, thanks. Also for you, Mahesh. So the question, Mahesh, shouldn't reduction in fossil fuel use also reduce claim frequency and severity and/or expense?
Absolutely. I think, as I said, yeah, the direction we are going nationally and globally is a good thing. Yeah, from how we transport people and goods, going to cleaner fuels, going to zero emission vehicles. I think I'm fully supportive of all of that. And I suspect as we see an increase in those fuel uses and those vehicles, we should see a complementary decline in gas stations, right? And so it's kind of a supply demand thing. And I would expect to see more fuel stations close down, and then thereby, we'd be dealing with those cleanups and hopefully that. But yeah, certainly I would expect to see fewer claims in the long run. Initially, I think we'll be, as we go through closures and all that, I think we'll be uncovering and doing a bunch of cleanup again. But I think that hopefully we've become more effective at doing that, and we'd be able to do that more efficiently and in a timely manner. But yeah, in the long run, I think you see it balance out to see a reduction in claims.
Let me jump in and add to that. I think the short term, it may drive up some claims because likely the older stations will be the ones that close. It seems like that's how it works. When you have a contraction in fuel sales, then the least profitable ones will close, and that might be the ones that have the most potential to have claims versus the newer stations. So we might see some initial costs, but then down the road it will probably reduce claims.
Great, thank you both. So we do have still a few more minutes here we wanted to dedicate just following Mahesh and Theron's presentations. But in the meantime, I'll just this is more of a comment. Mahesh, someone had said that they're aware of Colorado's website on petroleum brownfields with a story map and other resources. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I'd say go to our website and look at that. The brownfields was kind of created through our Petroleum Cleanup and Redevelopment Fund, and the monies that we had in that, and we were able to do a bunch of really good work. And right now we're a little strapped because the balance in that fund is pretty low, but we're so excited and on some of the foundations that we've laid that we hope that that'll help, as the economy picks up, we'll be able to figure out a way to make that healthy and functional again. But yeah, if you go to our website, OPS, just Google Division of Oil and Public Safety, Colorado, you'd be able to go to the story maps.
Great, thanks. So I'm trying to clarify someone's question. It's not reminder to everyone, if you could please let me know who your question's for. It makes things a little easier. So I think the question is, and I'll just put it out there for both of you. Do you think the projected decline in, they're saying review, I'm not sure if they mean review or revenue, but do you think the projected decline will push the Rebecca adverse states to reevaluate?
Colorado is already a Rebecca state, so we use risk-based decision making. I think the bigger question I think is will kind of the powers that be in the legislature say, hey, as this trend continues, should the state be funding this, or should we push that the cleanup responsibility and reimbursement to private insurance? I think that's what I think is more likely to happen than just going to or you could go to a more, if you have less money and you have to prioritize, then you would prioritize higher risk sites, I suppose.
Yeah, and I just add, I mean, states have different reasons for their, their cleanup policies, and certainly money plays a factor in your decision. There may be other factors that still trump it that would keep states from wanting to go toward Rebecca, but if you see a significant decrease, then you've got to find a solution.
Great. All right. Well, please, folks, please send the questions. Continue to do that, and we'll hang on to those time permitting towards the end. So again, I want to extend a big thank you to both Mahesh and Theron for presenting today. So finally, for the third portion of our webinar today, I'm happy to introduce Greg Travis with Berkeley Environmental, David Waddles with the Idaho Petroleum Storage Tank Fund, and Robert Winterburn with Chubb Environmental.
Okay, thank you, Drew. And David's bringing the slide up. So first of all, thank you to NWEPIC and the Planning Committee for including us in today's session. We always appreciate the opportunity to learn from the EPA and the states on their experiences and just to be included in the discussions surrounding tanks. And in particular today, while we're looking at a longer term horizon, forward looking, and the potential consequences of change from the status quo. So again, thank you. And then Bob has a Bob, are you muted?
There we go. Unmuted.
All right.
First technology stumble was me. All right. So before we jump into today's presentation, we should clarify that insurance companies cannot meet to discuss coverages, pricing of accounts, or divide up specific customers among each other. All act independently based on the company's strategy to a particular product or industry segment. No one company or person speaks as an authoritative voice for the insurance market. Now I can turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, thank you. So just a quick overview of some of the items we're going to discuss here. What's been very interesting about this process is, PSTF, the Idaho Petroleum Storage Tank Fund, is a unique animal. We are in the family of cleanup funds, but we are by definition an insurance company, but funded with public dollars. So we're a bit of a hybrid, which makes it interesting because we obviously have commonality with state funds. We also have quite a lot in common with the private insurers. And we were going to kind of go over that here in this presentation and discuss where we parallel and where we differ with regard to funding, underwriting, loss control, and we're also going to touch on compatibility and catastrophic exposures.
So one of the ways we thought we could do this, just to in plain English, when Bob or David or I say underwriting or underwriter, that's just our vocabulary for someone who evaluates risk. So we're going to build up to those specific points on consumption trends and impacts that Theron and Mahesh have laid out. But we thought it'd be useful if we did some comparison and contrasting in order to get there. And so on this slide, the first 2 rows illustrate in the example of comparing insurers to the Idaho Petroleum Storage Tank Fund that we provide similar coverage. So on the first row, whether it's fund-led or insurer, we're aligned in paying for cleanups from covered storage tank systems. And then on the second row, in the Idaho Fund, they also provide coverage for defense. So those are areas where we're similar. And Dave?
Yeah, on the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about our funding. Some folks have asked some questions earlier in the session here that maybe they'll find this part interesting. And then we're also going to look at the fact that obviously we're on one side of the boxes here, and the folks with the private are on the other side here with regard to what Bob's going to discuss here regarding premiums determined by actuarial analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so private insurance companies come up with rating factors based upon an actuarial analysis. So these factors are applied to storage tank risk characteristics such as age, construction, and capacity of the storage tank in order to determine a premium. This method of pricing is a significant difference from between private insurance and the Idaho Fund because it really allows us to continue to write this business without directly being impacted by changes within fuel revenue. We're going to discuss a little bit more about the details around storage tank rating and components later in the presentation. So I'm just going to flip it back to Dave.
Yeah, so the reason we have this next bullet here is because of the fact that we are operating as an insurance company, but not utilizing the adjustments that you can make with actuarial analysis and premium calibrations. We actively engage in on-site loss control, and we'll go into a little bit of the detail on that, on what we're doing to help manage our risk and offset our potential for frequency and hopefully reduced severity. And additionally, we have exclusionary language in our policy specific to prior contamination. The State Insurance Fund, when it was founded, we based it on the fact that we would only have coverage available for tanks covered under contract. So prior to the policy contract being issued, as needed, we will perform pre-insurance site assessments to verify the condition of the site with regard to prior contamination that may need to be further identified, and we can notify the operator, the responsible party, of the condition if it's adverse, and they're required to take that information and act upon it. Both private and PSTF, we're looking at the same thing. We are based out of this policy, and the policy is the instrument in the contract for making determinations regarding coverage for whether it's going to be accepted or denied. And for us, each claim is evaluated on a case-by-case basis, subject to the terms and the conditions of the policy contract. One anecdotal aspect of that is insurance policies are contracts of adhesion. So what that means is if we wrote the contract and you as the consumer have to accept it, there's some probable bias there that could be extrapolated. Hey, we wrote it. But the way the courts rule is that because of that factor, any ambiguity in the language of the policy contract would be in the favor of the insured. So that's where you get into the contract of adhesion component there. With regard to our funding sources, this may seem similar to other funds. The bulk of our revenue is through the transfer fee, and it's a very small sliver of a penny for every gallon that comes in, but it's enough to keep us funded and staying healthy there. The money that we have in our unencumbered surplus, we do invest it, but these are extremely conservative bonds. The goal there is to just not lose money on those. So, depending on the bond market fluctuations, it's a pretty nominal return on that. And then with the application fees, this is probably similar to many states, and how we charge per tank per annum. And something that we don't do that some states are doing is they are looking at the age of the tanks and making calibrations to the fees. And PSTF has not made that adjustment as of yet, but that's something that could be considered down the road. So with regard to COVID, the information here is from the State Tax Commission, and it's indicative of the changes year over year from 2019 to 2020. And this is just from January to July of those respective years. And as you can see, the biggest impact has been to commercial aviation, with the jet fuel numbers being where they're at. I do have some conflicting information that I received from my marketers. My major marketers are telling me that they're seeing a greater impact than what's reflected here. So I do question whether or not the protracted and delayed delivery of this information may be a little skewed, especially when you look at the national numbers. There's obviously a trend, but I think at the same time, I think COVID uniquely has made Idaho a more attractive state. So our state's had a lot of growth with folks relocating from out of state, because now they have a truly remote job. They can live where they want and continue retaining their income. And Idaho seems to be a very appealing area. So we are definitely growing, and that may be offsetting those numbers. And I wanted to hand this over to Greg to kind of bring up the private insurer impact.
Yeah, so in general, we've given a hint about the consumption and its impact. And so certain observations about COVID, the insurance industry in general, to the question of our insurers impacted, and that's obviously yes. There's plenty of public announcements by each individual insurance company as to what they've been. They vary, based on the insurance products that they offer and the sectors that they operate in. But there are also some additional requirements for insurers that Bob will touch on here for a sec.
Yeah, so to kind of echo what Greg was saying too, some of the challenges we experience within insurance are very similar to what everyone else has experienced with regard to remote working, communication, new technologies such as Zoom and WebEx, adjusting to a new normal. These are all things that I think everyone on this call has dealt with, in some aspect. But we've had some unique challenges within the insurance industry. We've had to stay on top of some various State Department of Insurance directives and bulletins that address numerous items, including but not limited to issuance of non-renewal notices for policies, policy non-renewals themselves, and policy cancellations, to name a few. Many states issue such bulletins, which added a whole nother level of complexity for the insurance industry when renewing coverage. I am happy to say that, after the first probably couple of weeks, everything kind of smoothed out and is pretty much back to normal at this point. Another issue we experienced, particularly within the environmental arena, early on, was obtaining underwriting information in order for us to look at renewal policies or look at new business policies coming in. You know, things like signed applications became an issue, obtaining integrity testing and performing engineering reviews. Many of the insured had difficulties providing such information early on because they did not have access to the information. They couldn't retain a vendor in order to perform the work that was required, or they were just unable to communicate information to us. We remained flexible throughout this time period in order to work through these issues. And like I said, it's been somewhat successful. And I think to this point, we're pretty much back to normal. So, Greg?
Yeah, so as Bob was just saying, you know, our insureds, tank insureds, our owners and operators of tank systems, you know, were they impacted? Yeah, they were, certainly, and some more than others. And it did, as kind of Theron was saying, you know, kind of gave many, you know, kind of a quick snapshot of like, they need to focus, you know, especially in our retail fuel segment of customers where, you know, their delivery of service to their customers, you know, which isn't exclusively fuel since they run, say, convenience stores, but it, you know, was a quick refocusing, but can extrapolate to the future. But, you know, to the question of, you know, did the decrease in consumption have a similar impact this year that Theron and Mahesh have illustrated? And that answer is no. As Bob mentioned, because our premiums aren't based on sales or revenue. They're based on our opinion of the exposure, of the potential for a release from a given system. And so since that's not consumption, so whether it's COVID or some other decrease in fuel volume, we're not quite the same. So we can illustrate our point a little more in general so that we can kind of connect these dots. That I want it to come across as our optimistic view on tanks and fuel blends and consumptions, just to retouch the basics that insurers are willing to and continue to provide coverage for tanks for many reasons, but here are a couple of them. The tank systems meet basic insurance requirements of releases or losses aren't accidental, they're not intentional, they're accidental, they're not intentional. A proof of loss can be demonstrated, you know, costs can be calculated and determined, contamination can be measured. No one single loss is so severe that to reasonably cover, we do that through limits. The limits are fixed. There's a large enough population of tanks to spread the risk of any particular loss over time, which I think in this forward-looking discussion today, we have the benefit of time as long as we're looking forward. And so we can do the basic calculation of frequency, geographic spread, because we're not exposed to the same event, COVID being unique though, as an exception. Another reason is it's a regulated space. Everyone on this call, the rules exist that outline the responsibilities of the regulator, the tank owner, the consultant, the service provider, the insurer, all which lead to, you know, we got predictable behaviors, standardized processes that have been built over time. So there's often a real alignment of interest. If there's a release, it's discovered quickly, and typically, you know, it may be smaller and the environment's protected and business interruptions minimized. And then is another reason, as Mahesh and Theron have illustrated, there's a long-term market potential still. Liquid fuels will continue for a long time, regardless of the blend type, you know, the blend and type. Liquid fuels are going to require storage, and many of our insureds continue to make significant capital investments to meet that storage requirement. And then the last reason being that tank systems are durable, long-term. You know, there's a competitive marketplace of manufacturers, suppliers, contractors, you know, all looking to maximize the life of those systems, both new systems and old systems. And so Bob and I will go into a little more about private insurance here on the next slide.
Thanks, Greg. So with regard to private insurance, we go to kind of build upon a little bit about the premiums driven by actuarial analysis we talked about earlier in a previous slide. when looking at private insurance, on how private insurance determines policy premium versus a fuel tax model used by most state funds to generate revenue, you should understand that the insurance policy's pricing is not impacted by the fluctuation in the fuel consumption. Insurance companies price storage tank policies through underwriting specific risk characteristics associated with a storage tank. This model isolates us from the revenue fluctuations related to the changes in fuel consumption. Greg's going to talk a little bit more about the premium adjustment factors and how we generally determine premium within private insurance.
Yeah, so that actuarial analysis can set what we would call a base, and then we can make actual location-specific factors based on the particular characteristics of the tank system. Tank age being one of them. It's a surrogate data point for our general question of how long will it be before a tank comes out of the ground, perhaps. The size of the tank as well as a factor, and the type of tank construction material is another one. And then we also have these other adjustments that we're able to vary, such as the deductible, which we could conceptually view as the ability for our insured to share in the risk. Many of our insureds are able to take a very high retention consistent with their own individual risk management strategy. Others don't. Recall that insurers are required to pay as necessary on the first dollar and then recoup if so. The insurer is on the credit risk, if you will. If we were to set a very high deductible, it's still incumbent on the insurer to pay first. And then the minimum limits, the policy limits here are set by FR. And then higher limits may also be available, but they also have a price consequence. So with all that said, I mean, we also make decisions based on data. And that's what the next slide we're going to walk through, just touch on a little bit.
All right, so for the underwriting and loss control slide here, so on this slide, we'd like to compare the underwriting and loss control processes between the Idaho State Fund and private insurance. This is consistent with our prior comparison that there really are more similarities than there are differences. I'm going to speak to these first four here, where we all do pretty much the same thing under through the initial underwriting process. Applications are obtained. An application for us is probably the most important piece of information we get from an insured. It really tells us whether or not there are any changes from the prior year. Did they add any tanks? Did they remove any tanks? Were there any releases? Those type of things. If a tank remains in regulatory compliance, again, extremely important for us to know that these tanks are being operated properly. We in the insurance do not go out and do pre-binding inspections, so we take on the insured's word that they are meeting the requirements set by the states, and we rely on the state inspectors that are going out and doing the inspections to ensure that that compliance is being met. Within the application process, we identify whether or not there's any releases during the recent policy period, and if they were looking to pull any tanks during the upcoming policy period. So this is all vital information that we pull out of the application itself. Within document review, there may be multiple documents we look at in addition to an application, and these could be examples of documents, could be an SPCC plan for above ground storage tanks, because we not only insure the regulated underground storage tanks, we'll also insure unregulated underground storage tanks and above ground storage tanks. So we ask for things like SPCC plans. We look at walkthrough inspection reports that are performed, storage tank registration information in order to confirm what's being put on the application, whether it's a 1995 double wall fiberglass tank, and to confirm that's what it's registered as. And we also look at state inspections. So as the states perform inspections and post that information, we're able to obtain that and take a look at that. Verification of compliance testing. Again, this is done by both the fund and through private insurance. This is another vital piece of our underwriting process. We look at whether it be third-party integrity testing of tanks, lines, sumps, spill buckets. We look at ATG test results. We look at interstitial monitoring results. We look at cathodic protection results. This all validates to us, number one, that the tanks are being maintained, they're being operated properly, and they're not currently at risk of a release. When there's questions, when we review this information and maybe there's some additional questions that still lay out there, we may take a step to do an environmental questionnaire to obtain some more information in order to underwrite the exposure. And that typically surrounds around maybe some of our larger portfolios. We want to better understand about how our insured is deploying employee training for the A, B, and C operator training. We look at the emergency response process. We'll look at product delivery information, determine whether or not, do they take product deliveries only during working hours and are they supervised? And we look at maintenance information. So all this information is looked at during the underwriting process. And Greg's going to take it from here and talk a little bit more about the prior contamination exclusions.
Yeah, so we're, that compliance testing, is basically a show us that you're compliant. And it's a way of reinforcing that a different leverage point of, to restate it, would be compliant. So perhaps from our alignment of all of our efforts on the call, of public policy to find releases in a timely manner so they're minimized as much as possible, which we think is part of the key going forward. As we've looked at the projections, that Theron and Mahesh have laid out, these other points of, prior contamination, we don't cover known loss. Removal oversight, where we require notice of removal so that we can have a conversation at least with our insured ahead of time, and have the option of have one of our consultants there. So since that's when releases are frequently discovered, is when they come out of the ground. And then we have the ability to do phone surveys, which is kind of another tool in our toolbox, just to follow up with our insured regarding questions we may have on any of the documentation, application, questionnaires, et cetera, that we've had. And then Dave will talk about loss control.
Yeah, with the, as mentioned in the preceding slides here, we mentioned the fact that for us to offset the actuarial component, loss control is critical for our long-term viability and effectiveness. And this would illustrate that. So we have 4 field reps that are in the field constantly to the tune of 2,700 site visits per year, and that's every single site. Before we offer to renew the site, our field reps are out there to verify the condition of the site and make sure the management practices are indicative of a risk we can continue to insure. They will also make an effort there at that time to remind or verify compliance testing that we're collecting at each renewal. We also have them do mid-year loss control visits, and this is an opportunity to just do a check-in, make sure the condition of the site is still favorable, and identify any issues, point those out to the responsible party, and help them maintain a quality site. And we do have some problematic sites that we're a little more concerned about that, periodically when we're there, they tend to have more issues than the well-run sites. And we'll put these folks on a quarterly loss control visit. And it's interesting to see how the operators feel about our guys, because you know, there's the state regulators are out there once every 3 years in the state of Idaho, and here our guys are in that same period of time showing up about 6 times. So they become more familiar with our guys, and some of them either they look at it as, wow, you're really in our business, and they don't appreciate it. And then it's funny, because on the other side of that, we have major operators who look at it and say, this is fantastic. We're paying $25 a year per tank to have somebody out here who's competent, understands the systems, and is identifying issues maybe early on before they become larger issues. And there's a preventative component there and a reduction component, as you can see the impact on claims. Now, I do need to put this in context. I think one thing that may skew this statistic here or stat line is the fact that most of our claims are not discovered by the field reps. But when there is that common denominator, when a release is discovered by the field rep, the average cost is much lower. We're showing the average claim at $161,000. When our field reps don't discover them, they're obviously higher, and when they do discover them, they're remarkably lower. And I think that's really just an opportunity to mitigate the severity of potential releases when we have our guys out there and they're catching those leaks and weeps that you know, can build up over time, and if undiscovered can be far more severe. And it's interesting. They, you know, we definitely feel that, you know, there's a tandem effort here between the services that we provide and the inspectors. And just to clarify also with regard to the inspectors, I think part of this volume is they're going to do a much more intense evaluation of a site condition. They're looking for more information, and they have a much longer checklist. We are really there looking for overall condition and compliance. And I will say, you know, with us having this presence, our loss control field reps are definitely noticing an improvement in the overall condition of the sites ever since the monthly self-inspections initiated in Idaho in October of 2018. So definitely, I think things are going in a positive direction, and I think that's reflected here by our LUST trends. And I know for states like you know, Colorado, these numbers look fairly paltry, but I think you know, at the end of the day, they are indicative of the national you know, trends that are going on between, you know, the complement of regulation and financial responsibility and the efforts we have to do to control our costs and mitigate risks. And so I think it all comes together for a fairly complementary you know, orchestration of results there. One thing, you know, that's obviously on everyone's mind is compatibility with the different fuels that are coming out. That you know, systems were obviously not specifically designed to handle the increase in ethanol. And you know, we've had communication with our local regulators, and they've expressed concern, and they look at us as an opportunity to help get out the message with regard to, you know, obligations for responsible parties, and what, you know, their responsibilities are specific to verifying compatibility. So we've been sending a formal notice to all of our policyholders with their renewals. In that notice, you know, we're making them aware of the regulatory compliance aspects. We are also pointing out policy language that could impact their coverage if they were to have a release after shifting to a fuel product that their system's not compatible with. There's certain policy conditions and exclusions that may apply, and we put that factor out there that, you know, you may not have coverage if you know, there's obvious gross negligence in the failure to make sure that you have a system that can accommodate the product you want to market. Greg's going to talk a little bit about catastrophic exposures.
Yeah, so since much of our insured locations are in states without funds, recall Will and Emma's map from way back at the start. As insurers, we have the ability to focus efforts on one or many geographic areas. And so for insurers that choose to be in several geographic locations, we have the ability to achieve a geographic spread of risk. Even with that, we monitor what we would call concentration of risk. And so to see geographically where we measure the potential impacts of any one event. And so here in 2020, we've been very active with fires in the Pacific Northwest in particular, for floods and hurricanes over the last several years. Multiple named storms in the Gulf Coast and on the eastern seaboard. And while these events bring significant property damage, and you always see dollar estimates of damage from certain storms, and how much of those are insured losses and uninsured losses. Historically, though, when it comes to tanks, they're not a significant source or cause of new pollution conditions or releases from storage tank systems. So long term, we monitor those, whether it's fire or flood or hurricane, tornadoes, but we don't see any reason for us to say we should exit a certain geography because of them, since they don't drive release frequency or cleanup severity based on our spread. And perhaps earthquake is a little different. So Bob, you want to touch on that real quick?
Yeah. So when we started putting together this slide, you noticed that earthquake is not on this map from NOAA. But in talking amongst us, I thought it was something that we needed to include in here because, in my opinion, earthquakes represent the greatest exposure to USTs among these catastrophic type exposures that we just looked at here. An earthquake event can cause a sudden catastrophic loss of tank contents, or could create a minor release that goes unnoticed for a period of time. So knowing the concentration of risk in an earthquake impact area is an essential part of managing this type of an exposure. Like Greg says, the insurance companies have the ability to look at risk and look at concentration of risk. We have the ability to, we map out where our locations are at. When we have any of these type of catastrophic exposures, we're able to look at what storage tanks, what locations are within that impact area, and react to that accordingly. So with that said, we can move over to the last slide and finish it up.
Yeah, we're borrowing this graphic from the EPA. It was released a while back, and I think it's definitely indicative of the fact that all of us are working in harmony for the same goal to reduce the number of lost events, and both from frequency and severity, and mitigate the future losses. And I think it takes the efforts of regulators, insurance providers, service providers, testing companies, environmental consultants, and all of us are coming together to contribute to a healthy direction. And Greg?
Yeah, that was exactly, I think, the sentiment we were going to leave to turn it back to Drew, and we're happy to take a few questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, thank you, Greg, David, and Robert. And we did get a handful of good questions. So I think what we'll do here, I do want to spend some time with our last three presenters here to kind of let them field questions, the three of them, and then I did kind of hang on to a few throughout today. So depending on what time we have, which looks like we have a good amount of time left, we'll bounce back eventually to kind of opening things up to the whole panel. So with that, let me go ahead and pull these questions up. So some of these are addressed to one of you three individually. Some are more open-ended. So as you all have done a great job of, I'll ask you to just kind of answer them like you presented, as a group or individually. So first question. All right, so some of these are a little longer, so bear with me. First question. Does the data show any trend of large marketers losing market share back to small retailers in Idaho since people are traveling less, maybe fueling up more closer to home? And my question is for David.
I think what we've seen is a consolidation trend. I think the larger marketers are tending to absorb, the smaller retailers, and they're taking over stores. And I think the fortunate byproduct of that is more often than not, if they come in, they have the capacity to do an upgrade. Get rid of old tanks, upgrade the system, and give the store a facelift. But for the most part, we've seen a pretty high volume of that shift the other way. It's not going the other way where we're seeing smaller mom and pops opening up shop. It's definitely the inverse.
Thanks. So I'll put this to the three of you. If state funds have less funds and have to decrease the number of claims accepted, is there a possibility insurance companies would insure them? And then the follow-up question is, how does that work with release cleanups that were not completely covered by the state programs?
Drew, could you ask that one more time? I just want to make sure that it was a long
one. Let me just read the first one off, first part of that question first. So the question is, if state funds have less funds and have to decrease the number of claims accepted, is there a possibility insurance companies would insure them?
Insure the state funds themselves, or insure the tank owners that are part of the state fund? I'm trying to understand the question.
So while you
sure, I'll invite that person to reframe it if they could, based on what was just mentioned. But kind of like you were going to say something there, Greg.
Yeah, we will say that we do insure tanks in many states that have state funds already, and some of that is just from a preference of the particular tank owner operator. Some of them are multi-state or a national chain, or have national presence, and that's just part of their risk management program that they procure their financial responsibility via private insurance, and that's their first stop. So that's one part of that answer. But then
Thank you.
Clarity on. All right.
Sure. Yeah, and that person feel free who sent that in to clarify. Okay, so another question for David. Does Idaho PSTF use the list on your underwriting and loss control slide for underwriting and premium cost, or termination of coverage and or eligibility?
That's a good long question there. So I'm trying to break that into two parts there. As far as can you repeat the very beginning of that? It was, do we use the checklist? Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. No worries. These are compound questions for you guys. Yeah. So thanks for your patience. So the first part of this question, David, does Idaho PSTF use the list on your underwriting and loss control slide for underwriting and premium cost?
Well, our premium costs are flat, so we don't calibrate our pricing. So that's why we have to take such an aggressive approach with regard to loss control and putting dollars into making sure that we're validating the condition of sites rather than putting that onus on the insured. We step that up to a higher degree of care. And I think the second half of that question was specific to coverage acceptance and really, or excuse me, coverage from an underwriting standpoint, not from a claim standpoint. And we have basically a very broad, coverage. Basically, we're not going to deny somebody from having coverage unless they have an extreme scenario where they cannot provide evidence of compliance. Really is probably one of the main things. And then we do have some situations where when somebody applies for coverage and we do our pre-insurance assessments, and an extreme amount of contamination is discovered, and that it would appear that contamination is a threat to human health and safety, whether that's immediate on-site or off-site, we will deny the application. But if that same operator notifies the regulator and they are working on a corrective action, we have been known to accept coverage even with contamination with an ongoing LUST event, as long as we can see documentation that they're cooperating with the regulators.
Great, thank you. So this next one is a two-parter. The first part's pretty straightforward. So the first part, how are deductibles determined? And they follow up with, in their state, we are seeing more and more high dollar deductibles with clauses that seek to make the fund the first payer.
Bob, you want that one?
Well, I can jump on I can talk about the deductibles themselves. Often are determined by the insured, what they want. We have an online platform that they can go and procure coverage for storage tank, and they can select a $5,000, $10,000, or $25,000 deductible. Whatever they feel is the higher the deductible, the lower the premium. So it's really whatever they choose to do. Having said that, there are instances as tanks begin to get older, especially over the age of 30 years of age. Us at Chubb, we would look to then remain on coverage, but then also transfer some of the exposure over to the insured in the form of a deductible. So you may see deductibles at $100,000 or higher in those instances. So to answer the question, in most of the cases, it's really driven by the insured. In some of the cases, it's driven by the exposure of the tank itself. And we have many policies where if there's 10 locations on the policy, one location may have that high deductible when other locations would have a much lower deductible because the tanks are, within an age that we feel comfortable, using a $25,000 or $50,000 deductible or something like that.
And then the second part of that question talked about what I would refer to as an excess of state fund type of coverage. And so that type of coverage, if done, really is truly an excess coverage. It doesn't meet financial responsibility requirements. So in my opinion, or in our product, we wouldn't issue a certificate of financial responsibility with that, because the financial responsibility would actually be with the fund at that point, and the insured would then be demonstrating their financial responsibility with the fund, and an insurance policy would only respond once those dollars have been exhausted. And so it'd be like a catastrophic coverage if you had a cleanup that required in excess of the statutorily required limits for that particular location or owner operator.
Great, thank you both. So this next one, we're gonna do one more just for this final set of panelists. It's a multiple choice, and then we're gonna go ahead. I think some of these questions logically invite the rest of the panel in, so I'll go ahead and open it up for the rest of the panel. So the final one for our last three presenters, and it's actually for you again, David. You had that slide with the fees. So is the $5 and the $25 per tank fee, is that a yearly fee?
That's correct. Yeah, it's an application fee. Yeah, $5 for the heating oil tanks and $25 per tank for all the others. And yeah, pretty straightforward.
Great, thank you. Okay, great. So we've got a little time left, and like I said, there's kind of a random smattering of questions left that I think different folks can chime in on. So at this point, I'll just invite the panel, any of these questions that you want to speak to. We'll do this, open-ended with the whole panel. So the next question, I think, might bring in our EPA friends if they wanted to chime in on it, but it is directed to the final three presenters. So the question is, if the facility is refused coverage by your program, how do they meet the EPA requirement?
So
Probably need to address the reason for why they're refused. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, the other part is that while insurance is only one of several other mechanisms to demonstrate financial responsibility in that case. So it's not the exclusive remedy if they're not in a fund state.
And folks, I can only read to the attendees. I can only read what's in front of me. So if you wanted to send anything to clarify your question, unpack it a little further, I invite you to do so. All right, let me jump back to our first presenters with Will and Emma. So the question is, does the EPA disregard commingled releases? And an example given was chlorinated solvents when determining the cleanup time.
Good question. We're relying on state reported data. We have an Excel workbook with several worksheets, and the states give us that information. So I can't actually answer that universally. States can include comments in their data along with their data and flag that. I have not seen that. So to the best of my knowledge, that has not been a factor, but I'm not 100% certain since it's state reported data.
Thank you. So this one goes back to Theron and or Mahesh, if you both wanted to chime in if you have an answer. But the question, do the revenue projections include the incoming administration's stated objective to transition away from oil and gas?
Probably not directly, but it kind of goes back to some of the, the projections as far as fuel efficiency and that, at least moving that direction. So that would be a whole nother factor that we would add to the list, I guess.
Thank you. I do see a few minutes left of time, so sorting through these final questions. If anyone want to send off, any attendees want to send in a final question, now would be the time to do that. So this might be good for the entire panel. So the question is, how does the annual state fund revenue compare to commercial insurance premiums? I don't know who wants to start that off, but anyone wants to take a stab, feel free.
Yeah. I think you're comparing on that. I think you're comparing apples to oranges, since the revenue sources are so different, and there's so many more states with state funds versus states without state funds. So I think that would be a very difficult comparison to even try to make.
Yeah, the one thing I might have that could help, but I just don't have it at my fingertips, is in our actuarial analysis, the actuary will give us a number that based on the losses that we've had over time, what the actual cost in premiums would be for us to provide coverage on a per tank basis. And the numbers are pretty remarkable. And it's obviously we're offering coverage for $25 a tank, and they're telling us if somebody wanted that same coverage, they'd be paying in excess of $2,000 a year per tank. But I apologize, don't quote me on that number. I haven't looked at that in a bit, but we do get that comparative analysis. But obviously that's forfeiting the concept of us having that revenue via the fuel transfer fee.
I was just going to add, if you look at it facility by facility and compare throughputs, then it really just depends Some facilities will account for more because they sell more fuel. Some facilities will account for almost nothing if it's an emergency generator. So, you know, they probably pay more for insurance than they would for through a, you know, a fund throughput, versus bigger facilities is probably flipped extremely the other way. So state funds tend to flatten it out for everybody.
Great. Thanks everyone for chiming in. So I'll put this last one out there. It kind of builds off of a piece of what we all talked about today. So feel free to answer if you'd like to add. I think this will be our last question today. So to any and all presenters, what are your thoughts about what will happen since the COVID numbers are rapidly increasing again?
I think we're going to go through a few waves of increasing cases and kind of tightening down on protective measures, stay at home and all of that. But I think eventually, with a vaccine on the horizon, things will kind of be on the up and up. But yeah, it's kind of hard to predict right now. But I think in Colorado, we are kind of going through the third wave, or expecting the third wave, which is now. So.
I was just going to defer to Mahesh's crystal ball because he had it in his presentation. So I'll go with that.
I like that answer, Theron, as well.
All right, I think we'll wrap there. If anyone has questions we didn't get to, Mahesh has the crystal ball, so feel free to reach out to him, or I can put you in touch with him after today's presentation. All right, well, I wanted to finish by extending a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Appreciate all the time you put into preparing and delivering today's webinar. Also, a big thank you to our partners at EPA's Office of Underground Storage Tanks and ASWAMO for helping planning this 4-part NTC webinar series. So just a reminder, you can always contact me if you have questions about our resources, but on NUIPIC's website, you'll find eventually a recording of today's presentation, as well as archived UST and LUST webinars from the past, our entire archive and all the issues for LUST line, as well as resources from previous National Tanks conferences and information on the next National Tanks conference. Friendly reminder to please take that survey. Everyone will be prompted to an evaluation form when they close out of today's webinar. And we, as always, really appreciate your feedback. Helps us improve our webinars for all of you moving forward. So I think we'll wrap today. Thank you everyone so much for attending our webinar, and we hope to see you again. So stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Drew.